Many worlds, one path through a larger reality, on multiplicity, experience, and the limits of access. By ccidfuentes, 2026. Abstract. This essay examines the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics as a philosophical account of reality, rather than a purely technical framework. It begins from a tension that is rarely confronted directly. The mathematical structure of quantum mechanics allows multiple outcomes to persist, while human experience presents only one realized world. What appears as a single unified reality may therefore reflect not what exists in full, but what can be accessed from within it. Rather than resolving this tension by introducing additional mechanisms such as collapse, the essay considers the possibility that nothing is being reduced at all. It draws on a simple principle, that a theory should not be supplemented beyond what its formal structure requires. On this basis, the many worlds interpretation is presented not as an extravagant extension, but as a refusal to remove possibilities that the theory itself preserves. From this perspective, reality may be less like a single path and more like an endlessly branching structure, an infinitely old tree that does not prune its own branches. What is experienced as one unfolding life may be only one continuous trajectory within that structure, complete from within, but not exhaustive of what exists. The apparent unity of the world may therefore be a feature of access, rather than a feature of reality itself. The central claim of the essay is that singular experience is not sufficient grounds for singular ontology. Once this distinction is taken seriously, the question shifts. It is no longer why there would be many worlds, but why it has been assumed that there must be only one. Introduction. Human experience presents reality as singular. At any given moment, the world appears to move forward along one path. Events unfold, decisions are made, and outcomes follow one another in a way that feels complete. There is no sense from within experience that anything remains open. What happens appears to be what happens. Yet this appearance carries an assumption that is rarely examined. At every moment, things could have unfolded differently. A word left unsaid, a movement taken or avoided, a decision made slightly earlier or later. Each introduces a point at which reality might have continued along another line. These alternatives are usually treated as unreal, as things that could have happened but did not. The world as it is experienced seems to move forward by closing these possibilities off. But what if nothing is ever closed? This question does not arise from imagination alone. It is built into the structure of modern physics. At the level of quantum mechanics, systems are not described as occupying a single definite state prior to observation. They are described as containing multiple possible outcomes at once, carried forward together within a single evolving structure. Crucially, this structure does not, on its own, select one outcome and remove the rest. This creates a tension that is often resolved too quickly. Experience presents a single result. The theory allows many. The usual response is to assume that reality must reduce itself to one outcome, and that the task is to explain how this reduction occurs. Yet this assumption is not clearly required by the theory itself. It may instead reflect the limits of experience rather than the limits of what exists. An alternative possibility follows. Rather than asking how multiple possibilities collapse into one, it may be more appropriate to ask whether they collapse at all. What appears as a single unfolding reality may not be singular in its structure, but singular in its accessibility. The world, as it is encountered, may be one continuous path through a broader system in which other paths persist. This essay explores that possibility through the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. It does not attempt to establish this interpretation as a definitive account of reality, but to examine whether it provides the most coherent reading of the theory when its structure is taken seriously. The broader claim is simple. The apparent singularity of the world may not be a property of reality itself, but a consequence of how it is accessed. Section 1. The continuity of the wave function. If the world appears to move from many possibilities to one outcome, it is natural to assume that something in reality performs that reduction. The question is whether the theory itself contains such a process. Quantum mechanics describes systems using the wave function. In simple terms, this is a representation of all the possible states a system can occupy at once, along with how those possibilities evolve over time. It does not begin from a single definite state waiting to be revealed. It begins from multiplicity. The crucial point is how this multiplicity develops. The equations that govern the wave function describe a smooth and continuous evolution. The possibilities do not fall away as time passes. They are carried forward together. What might happen is not removed. It remains part of the structure. This is not an interpretation added later. It is built into the theory. There is no step in the core equations where multiple possibilities are reduced to one. No moment at which alternatives are discarded. The structure evolves without interruption, preserving what it contains. If the wave function is taken seriously as a description of reality, then reality is not being presented as something that narrows itself at each moment. It is presented as something that continues to carry multiple possibilities forward, even as events appear to resolve from within experience. From within any one path, it feels as though the others have disappeared, but nothing in the structure requires that they have. This is where the tension sharpens. Experience suggests reduction. The theory does not describe it. It describes continuity without an elimination. The problem, then, is no longer simply why one outcome is observed. It is why one outcome is observed when nothing in the structure removes the rest. Section 2. The measurement problem. The difficulty now comes into view. If the structure of reality carries multiple possibilities forward, why is only one ever observed? Whenever a measurement is made, the result is definite. A particle is found in one place rather than another. A system appears in one state rather than many. From within experience, there is no trace of the alternatives, no overlap, no ambiguity, only one outcome. This stands in direct contrast to what the theory describes. The wave function contains multiple possibilities, and its evolution preserves them. Yet observation presents a single result. This is the measurement problem. The issue is not that the theory fails, its predictions are extraordinarily accurate. The problem is deeper. The structure of the theory and the structure of experience do not match. One describes continuity with many possibilities. The other presents a world in which only one outcome is ever encountered. In simple terms, before a measurement, a system is described as containing several possible states at once. After a measurement, only one is observed. The theory explains how the possibilities evolve. It does not explain why only one appears. The usual response is to assume that a selection must occur. Since only one outcome is observed, it is inferred that reality must reduce the range of possibilities to a single result. The task, then, becomes to explain how this reduction happens. But this step is not neutral. It introduces an assumption. It assumes that what is not observed no longer exists. This is where the problem sharpens. Is the reduction of possibilities required by the theory or inferred from the limits of experience? Does reality select one outcome, or does experience reveal only one of many that continue? If the theory itself does not remove possibilities, then the appearance of a single outcome may not reflect a process within reality at all. It may reflect a restriction on what can be accessed. What is observed as definite may not be the only thing that exists. It may be the only thing that can be reached. The measurement problem, in this sense, is not just technical. It is a question about the relationship between experience and reality. It marks the point at which what is described and what is encountered come apart. Section 3. The addition of collapse. One way to resolve the measurement problem is to introduce a process that reduces the range of possibilities to a single outcome. This process is known as collapse. On this view, the wave function evolves continuously under normal conditions, but changes abruptly when a measurement occurs, leaving only one result. This idea is widely used because it fits experience. When a measurement is made, only one outcome is observed, and collapse appears to explain why the many possibilities described by the theory give way to a single result. But this explanation comes at a cost. Collapse is not part of the core structure of the theory. The equations that govern the wave function do not contain it. The continuous evolution they describe includes no step in which possibilities are reduced to one. Collapse is added from outside as an extra rule. This changes what the theory is doing. Instead of a single set of principles, there are now two. One governs how systems evolve. The other is introduced to force that evolution to produce a single outcome. The result is not a unified description, but a combination of what the theory says and what is assumed to happen. The motivation for this addition is clear. Experience presents one outcome, so it is assumed that reality must produce one. Collapse preserves that assumption, but it does not arise from the structure of the theory itself. It reflects a prior commitment to a single world. Once this is recognized, the question becomes difficult to avoid. If collapse is not required by the theory, why introduce it at all? The difficulties that follow suggest that this question matters. What counts as a measurement is not clearly defined. When collapse occurs is not specified. What physical process carries it out is left open. These are not minor gaps. They point to the fact that collapse is not grounded in the same way as the rest of the theory. None of this prevents it from working in practice. It remains a useful tool for predicting outcomes, but usefulness is not the same as explanation. A model can reproduce what is observed while still relying on assumptions that do not reflect what exists. If the theory, taken on its own terms, does not eliminate possibilities, then collapse is not something it requires. It is something imposed to preserve the idea that only one outcome can exist. At this point, the direction of the argument shifts. The question is no longer how collapse occurs, it is whether it occurs at all. If the reduction of possibilities is not part of the theory, then the appearance of a single outcome must be explained differently, not by removing possibilities, but by understanding why only one is encountered. Section 4. Fidelity to structure. At this point, a more general principle comes into focus. When a theory provides a clear and internally consistent account of how a system evolves, its interpretation should remain faithful to that structure. What the theory does not require should not be introduced without strong reason. Quantum mechanics offers such a structure. The wave function evolves in a precise and continuous way. This evolution is mathematically well defined and experimentally successful. It predicts outcomes with remarkable accuracy, without invoking any mechanism that selects a single result from the possibilities it contains. Collapse departs from this structure. It introduces a second kind of behavior that is not described by the same equations. On the one hand, the system evolves continuously. On the other, it is assumed to undergo a sudden reduction when a measurement occurs. The result is not a single account, but two. This raises a straightforward question. If the theory already provides a complete rule for how systems evolve, why introduce another at all? The usual answer appeals to experience. Only one outcome is observed, so it is assumed that reality must produce one. But this is not a demand that comes from the theory. It comes from how the world appears from within a single path. Once this is recognized, the burden shifts. It is no longer enough to say that collapse matches experience. It must be shown that the theory is incomplete without it. Otherwise, the addition reflects an assumption rather than a necessity. This is where the principle becomes decisive. To remain faithful to the structure of a theory is not to deny what is observed. It is to distinguish between what the theory requires and what is inferred from experience. Observing one outcome does not show that all others have been removed. It shows only that one outcome is encountered. From this perspective, the expectation of a single world begins to look less like a conclusion and more like an unexamined starting point. If the theory does not eliminate possibilities, then the assumption that it must is open to doubt. The task, then, is no longer to explain how reality reduces itself to one outcome. It is to ask whether that reduction occurs at all. Section 5. Many worlds as minimalism. The many worlds interpretation begins from a single move. It takes the structure of the theory at face value and refuses to add anything that is not already there. If the wave function carries multiple possibilities forward, then those possibilities are not treated as temporary or incomplete. They are taken to be part of the structure itself. Nothing is removed. Nothing is forced to resolve. The system evolves as the equations describe, without interruption. From this point of view, the wave function is not a list of options waiting to be reduced. It is a structure in which multiple outcomes are already present and continue to develop. What changes is not the existence of these outcomes, but the ability to encounter them. As the system evolves, different possibilities cease to interact, even though they continue. This is where the shift in perspective becomes clear. What is usually called collapse is replaced by separation. The alternatives do not disappear, they become inaccessible. A useful way to think about this is to return to the idea of branching, not as a metaphor added from outside, but as a way of describing what the structure implies. Reality does not move along a single line that closes off alternatives behind it. It develops more like an endlessly growing structure, where each possibility continues along its own path. It is here that the image of the tree becomes useful, not as decoration, but as a way of seeing the structure more clearly. An infinitely old tree does not cut away its branches as it grows. Each branch continues outward, even if it is no longer connected to the path you follow. From within one branch, it feels as though the others are gone, but they have not been removed. They have only become unreachable. This is what Many Worlds proposes. Not that new worlds are created, but that the structure never eliminates possibilities in the first place. What makes this interpretation distinctive is not what it adds, but what it refuses to remove. It does not introduce a second process. It does not require a special moment at which reality selects a single outcome. It allows the theory to describe reality in the same way at all times. For this reason, it is often misunderstood as extravagant. The idea of many outcomes continuing appears excessive when compared to a single realized world. But this comparison reverses the situation. The theory already contains multiple possibilities. It is the removal of those possibilities that requires an additional step. Seen in this way, the direction of simplicity changes. Many worlds does not multiply entities beyond necessity. It accepts what the theory provides and leaves it intact. What appears excessive is not the presence of many outcomes, but the insistence that they must be reduced to one. From this perspective, the question is no longer why reality would branch, but why it would collapse. Section 6. Decoherence and silent separation. At this point, a natural objection arises. If multiple outcomes persist, why are they not observed? Why does the world appear stable and singular rather than blurred or overlapping? The answer lies in a process known as decoherence. The mathematics behind it is complex, but its effect can be understood in simple terms. When a system interacts with its surroundings, it does not remain isolated. It becomes entangled with its environment. Information about its state spreads outward into everything it interacts with. As this happens, the different possibilities contained in the wave function lose the ability to influence one another. Before this interaction, they can interfere. After it, they cannot. They continue to exist, but they no longer overlap in any meaningful way. A useful way to think about this is in terms of signals. When two signals interact, they can combine and interfere. But if they are separated and carried along different channels, they no longer affect each other. Each continues on its own, but without crossing paths again. This is what decoherence does. It does not remove possibilities, it separates them. From within any one of these developments, only a single outcome can be encountered. The others are not seen, not because they have disappeared, but because there is no longer any connection to them. They no longer share a common structure through which interaction can occur. This is the key point. Decoherence does not select one outcome and eliminate the rest. It explains why multiple outcomes can exist without being visible from within a single perspective. It replaces reduction with separation. In this way, the appearance of a single, stable world does not require that alternatives have been destroyed. It requires only that they have become inaccessible. What is experienced is one continuous line within a set of developments that no longer interact. The result is a kind of silence. The other possibilities are still present in the structure, but they no longer speak to one another. Each continues independently, without overlap, and without awareness of the others. From this perspective, the absence of observable multiplicity does not imply that multiplicity is absent. It reflects the conditions under which observation occurs. What is not observed may not be unreal. It may simply lie beyond the reach of interaction. Section 7. The illusion of selection. At the level of experience, events appear to resolve. A measurement is made and one outcome is observed. From this, it feels natural to conclude that reality itself has selected that outcome. One possibility becomes real, and the others are excluded. But this conclusion carries an assumption that is rarely examined. What is actually observed is not a process of selection, but the presence of a single accessible result. The idea that one outcome has been chosen depends on something further. It depends on the assumption that what is not observed no longer exists. Within the framework developed so far, that assumption becomes difficult to maintain. The wave function does not remove possibilities. Decoherence does not eliminate them, it separates them. If this is the case, then the appearance of a single outcome does not require that the others have been destroyed. It requires only that they are no longer accessible. This is not just a feature of physics. It reflects something familiar in everyday life. A message is sent, or it is not. A moment leads somewhere, or it passes without consequence. From within experience, it feels as though one path has been taken, and the others have simply fallen away. But what is actually given is only one path. This changes how the situation is understood. The idea that reality chooses an outcome may reflect the structure of experience, rather than the structure of reality. From within any given path, there is no access to alternatives. Their absence is not observed as absence. It is simply not encountered at all. A simple comparison makes this clearer. When moving through a landscape, only one path is ever visible at a time. The fact that other paths are not seen does not imply that they do not exist. It means only that they are not part of the route being followed. The same may be true here. Experiencing a single outcome does not show that reality has reduced itself to one possibility. It may show that observation is confined to one development within a larger structure. If this is the case, then the problem begins to shift. The question is no longer how reality selects one outcome from many. It is why experience is limited to one outcome at all. What appears as a decisive act of selection may instead be a consequence of perspective. A single path is encountered, not because it is the only one that exists, but because it is the only one that can be accessed from within that position. Section 8. Probability without elimination. If multiple outcomes persist, then the natural question follows: what does probability actually mean? In everyday thinking, probability is about what will happen. A coin is flipped, and there is a chance of heads or tails. One outcome will occur, and probability describes the likelihood of each. But this way of thinking depends on a hidden assumption. It assumes that only one outcome becomes real. If that assumption is removed, the meaning of probability changes. A coin is still flipped. Heads still appears about half the time, and tails about half the time. The observable pattern does not change. What changes is what the pattern represents. Probability no longer tells us which outcome happens. It tells us how outcomes are distributed. Both heads and tails continue. What probability describes is how often each outcome is encountered across the structure. Some outcomes appear more frequently than others. That is what the numbers reflect. From within any single path, this is experienced as uncertainty. You do not know which outcome you will encounter, so it feels as though one result will be selected. But this feeling comes from your limited position. There is a simple way to state the difference. From within one path, probability looks like chance. Across the full structure, it reflects distribution. This preserves everything that works. The same patterns appear in experiments. The same predictions hold. Nothing is lost. What changes is the interpretation. Probability no longer signals that realities must choose one outcome and discard the rest. It describes how different outcomes are spread across a structure in which they all persist. In this sense, probability does not compete with multiplicity. It makes multiplicity coherent. The uncertainty it expresses is not a sign that reality is undecided, but a sign that access is limited. Section 9. The perspective problem. At this point, a deeper issue comes into view. If only one outcome is ever experienced, what role does perspective play in shaping what appears to be real? In everyday life, perspective is rarely treated as a limitation. The world presents itself as complete, and what is experienced is taken to reflect what exists. But this assumption is not guaranteed. Every observation takes place from within a position, under specific conditions, with access to only part of the total information available. What is encountered is not the whole, it is a view. This becomes more significant in the context of quantum mechanics. An observer is not outside the system being described, but within it. The observer is part of the same evolving structure. What is experienced is therefore tied to one particular development within that structure, not to the structure as a whole. This has direct consequence. If multiple outcomes persist and become separated, then each observer will find themselves within one of them. The others are not accessible, not because they have been removed, but because there is no longer any connection to them. From within this position, the world appears singular. Only one outcome is available, and it appears complete. But this completeness may be local rather than global. It reflects everything that can be accessed from that position, not everything that exists. A simple comparison makes this clearer. Imagine standing inside a vast network of paths, but being able to move along only one of them. From where you stand, the path you follow appears to be the whole. The rest of the network is not visible, not because it does not exist, but because you are not positioned to see it. The same may be true of reality. What is experienced may be complete relative to perspective, but incomplete relative to the structure that contains it. This shifts the problem once again. The question is no longer why only one outcome is observed. It is why observation is confined to one outcome at all. The answer lies in position. To observe is to occupy a point within the structure, and that position determines what can be encountered. The singularity of experience is not evidence that reality is singular. It is evidence that access is limited. This does not make experience unreliable, it makes it partial. What is encountered may be a complete path through reality, but it may not be the only one. Section 10. The assumption of one world. The idea that reality must consist of a single unified world is rarely stated outright, yet it sits beneath much of the resistance to interpretations such as many worlds. It is treated as a starting point rather than something that needs to be justified. This assumption feels natural because experience presents a single world. Events follow one another, objects remain stable, the world appears coherent and continuous. It is easy to move from this observation to the conclusion that reality itself must be singular. But this step is not required. Nothing in the structure of quantum mechanics demands that only one outcome exists. The theory does not enforce singularity. It does not contain a principle that reduces reality to a single line. The expectation that there must be one world is not derived from the theory. It is brought to it. Once this is recognized, the position begins to shift. The single world is no longer the default. It becomes one interpretation among others. The source of the assumption is clear. Only one outcome is ever encountered, so it is inferred that only one outcome exists. The move feels immediate, but it is not logically necessary. The absence of access to alternatives does not show that they are absent. It shows only that they are not available from within the current perspective. This becomes easier to see in light of decoherence. If different outcomes become separated and no longer interact, then each will appear complete from within itself. There is no signal, no trace, no indication that anything lies beyond it. A single world is exactly what should be experienced from within one path, even if the structure contains many. The mistake, then, is subtle. What is encountered is taken to define what exists. The limits of experience are treated as the limits of reality. Once this is questioned, the situation changes. The unity of experience remains intact, but it no longer carries the same weight. It does not establish that reality is singular, it establishes only that access is confined. In this sense, the assumption of one world is not a conclusion of physics, it is an extension of intuition, and once it is recognized as such, it can no longer be taken for granted. Section 11. Identity as a thread. If multiple outcomes persist, then the question of identity changes. What does it mean to be a single individual in a structure where different versions of events continue independently? At any moment, things could unfold in more than one way. A meeting happens or is missed. A sentence is spoken or held back. A decision is made now or later. These moments often seem minor, but they carry direction. From one path, something begins. From another, it never does. From within experience, only one of these paths is ever lived. Because of this, life feels like a single continuous line. Each moment follows from the last. Your memories connect. Your identity feels stable and unified. There is no sense that anything else is unfolding alongside it. It feels as though the alternatives simply did not happen. But if the structure of reality does not eliminate possibilities, then something else must be true. At the points where things could diverge, there is not one future but several. Each outcome continues from the same past. Each carries forward a version of you with the same history up to that moment. There is no moment where identity moves between them. It continues along each path. From within any of these paths, nothing appears unusual. You still experience a single self moving forward through time. The other continuations are not perceived, not because they have been removed, but because they cannot be accessed. Each path presents itself as complete. This leads to a different way of understanding identity. Instead of a single self existing across all possibilities, identity can be understood as a thread. Each thread is a continuous sequence of experience, connecting to its own past and extending into its own future. The unity of self remains intact, but it exists within the path, not across the entire structure. This also explains something that is often felt but rarely examined. From within one path, the future does not appear open in the way it is often imagined. It appears as something that unfolds. You move through one sequence of events, and in that sense, your life feels fixed. Not because alternatives are absent, but because they are never encountered. You do not experience branching, you experience continuation. This is where the idea of fate can be understood more precisely. Your path is fixed in the sense that you only ever move along one line of events. You do not step between possibilities. You do not observe alternatives. You follow one trajectory from beginning to end. But this does not mean that only one trajectory exists. It means only that you are situated within one of them. Across the wider structure, different continuations unfold. There are paths where things turned out differently, paths where moments went another way, paths where what did not happen here continues elsewhere. From within your own path, these alternatives feel unreal, but that may reflect their inaccessibility, not their absence. In this sense, what is usually called a life can be understood as one trajectory through a wider system of possibilities. Identity does not split in a way that is experienced as fragmentation. It continues along multiple lines, each of which is experienced independently. To experience yourself as a single, continuous subject is not to show that only one such continuation exists. It is to show that you are on one of them. Section 12. The Scale of the Unseen. Up to this point, the argument has focused on how multiple outcomes can persist, and how experience is confined to one of them. What follows is a broader implication. The portion of reality that is directly encountered may be only a small part of what exists. This idea is not unfamiliar. Even in ordinary life, perception is limited. Only a narrow band of light is visible. Only a small range of sound can be heard. Most processes unfold without ever entering awareness. What is experienced is already a filtered version of a larger world. But multiplicity extends this limitation far beyond what is usually imagined. If different outcomes continue and become separated, then what lies beyond observation is not just distant or hidden in the usual sense. It is entire developments, entire sequences of events, entire continuations that evolve alongside the one that is experienced, but never intersect with it. From within a single path, there is no sign of this. The world appears complete. It does not feel partial or restricted. There is no indication that anything lies beyond it. This makes the conclusion feel natural. What is encountered is taken to be what exists. But this may be a mistake of scale. The unseen is not simply an extension of the visible. It may be the greater part of the structure itself. What is experienced may be one accessible segment within a system that extends far beyond it. A useful way to grasp this is to return briefly to the idea of branching, not as a metaphor but as a structural feature. At each point where events could diverge, different continuations follow. These do not collapse back together. They do not signal their presence. They continue independently. From within any of these paths, everything appears whole. But this sense of completeness is local. It reflects the limits of what can be accessed, not the limits of what exists. This creates a shift that is difficult to hold on to. Reality may not be a single unfolding line with hidden parts just beyond reach. It may be a structure in which entire developments exist beyond access, each internally complete, each carrying forward its own version of events. The scale of this is not just large, it is structural. It is not that there is more of the same world, it is that there may be many developments of it. From this perspective, the absence of observation carries less weight. What is not encountered is not necessarily unreal. It may simply lie outside the range of interaction. The boundary of experience does not mark the boundary of reality. What is experienced may be sufficient for navigating the world, but it may not be sufficient for defining it. The world as it is encountered may be complete as a path, but it may not be complete as a whole. Section 13. Multiplicity without chaos. A common reaction to the idea of multiple coexisting outcomes is that it would lead to disorder. If reality contains many developments rather than one, it can seem as though it must become fragmented or unstable. The intuition is that unity is required for coherence, and that multiplicity would undermine it. This concern is understandable, but it rests on a misleading assumption. It assumes that order depends on there being only one unfolding sequence of events. It assumes that if more than one development exists, they must interfere, overlap, or disrupt one another. In other words, it assumes that multiplicity means confusion. But this is not how structure works. Even within a single world, the level of complexity is already immense. Billions of people are making decisions, interacting, influencing one another, and shaping events in ways that no single perspective can fully track. At every moment, countless processes unfold simultaneously across different scales. Physical, biological, social, and technological systems all operate at once. Yet this does not result in chaos. The world remains structured, stable, and intelligible. Complexity does not eliminate order, it often reveals it. What allows this stability is not simplicity but consistency. The same underlying rules apply throughout. The behavior of systems remains constrained, even when the number of interactions becomes vast. Within quantum mechanics, this point becomes sharper. The evolution of the wave function is governed by strict and consistent laws. These laws do not produce arbitrary outcomes. They produce structured developments that follow precise patterns. The presence of multiple outcomes reflects how these patterns unfold, not a breakdown of coherence. What matters is not how many developments exist, but how they relate to one another. If different outcomes continued to interact freely, the concern about disorder would be justified, but decoherence prevents this. Once developments separate, they no longer influence one another. Each proceeds independently, without interference. This independence is the key. Each development remains internally ordered. From within any given path, the world retains its familiar stability. Objects behave consistently. Causes lead to effects. Experience remains continuous. The existence of other developments does not disrupt this, because they do not enter into the same chain of interaction. Multiplicity, in this sense, does not produce a tangled system. It produces a set of parallel, non-interacting developments, each coherent within itself. This distinction is crucial. Multiplicity at the level of the whole does not translate into chaos at the level of experience. The structure can expand without becoming disordered. What changes is not the stability of the world, but the scope of it. The assumption that order requires a single world may reflect a limitation in how order is understood. It treats unity as a condition for coherence, rather than recognizing that coherence can exist within many independent developments at once. Seen in this way, the many worlds interpretation does not replace a stable reality with an unstable one. It replaces a single stable structure with many stable structures, each evolving according to the same laws. The world does not become chaotic, it becomes larger. Section 14. Access and the limits of experience. A recurring theme now comes into focus. There is a difference between what exists and what is accessible. The appearance of a single outcome, the continuity of identity, and the absence of observable multiplicity all point towards the same feature of experience. What is encountered is not necessarily the full structure of reality, but a limited interface with it. This limitation is not unique to quantum mechanics. In ordinary life, perception is already selective. Only part of the environment is visible. Attention narrows this further. Understanding is built from what can be processed within these limits. What is known is shaped not only by what exists, but by what can be accessed. Within the many worlds framework, this limitation becomes structural. If multiple outcomes persist and become separated, then access to them is restricted by the very process that allows them to exist. Each observer occupies a position within one development, and that position determines what can be encountered. The structure does not simply contain many possibilities, it organizes access to them. This leads to a shift in how experience is understood. What appears as a single unified world may not reflect the underlying structure of reality, but the limits placed on access. The boundaries of experience are not necessarily the boundaries of existence. From this perspective, the earlier tension between theory and observation begins to dissolve. The theory describes a structure in which multiple outcomes persist. Observation presents a single outcome. These do not conflict if observation is understood as limited in scope. The difference is not a contradiction, it is a difference in level. This aligns with a broader point. What is encountered does not exhaust what exists. The fact that something cannot be accessed does not make it unreal. It means only that it lies beyond the current perspective. The implication is simple but far-reaching. The appearance of a single world does not require that reality itself is singular. It requires only that access is confined. What is experienced may be complete relative to that position, but not complete in itself. At this point, the argument converges. The continuity of the wave function, the absence of collapse, the role of decoherence, and the limits of perspective all point in the same direction. Reality may be more extensive than what can be encountered from within any single path. The limits of experience do not just restrict what is known, they shape what appears to be real. To recognize this is not to weaken experience. It is to place it within a wider structure where more may exist than can ever be reached from one point of view. Section 15. Multiplicity as the default. The argument has now taken a clear shape. The formal structure of quantum mechanics preserves multiple possibilities through continuous evolution. Collapse is not required by this structure, but introduced to reconcile it with the appearance of a single outcome. Decoherence explains how outcomes become separated without being eliminated. Perspective limits what can be accessed, and experience presents only one path through what may be a larger system. Taken together, these points lead to a shift in emphasis. The question is no longer whether multiplicity must be added to the theory. It is whether it has been there all along. If the formalism preserves multiple outcomes, and nothing within it removes them, then their persistence is not an extra assumption. It follows directly from taking the theory seriously. From this standpoint, the idea of a single world becomes less secure. It is not derived from the equations, nor required for their success. It arises from experience, from the fact that only one outcome is encountered. But, as has been shown, this encounter is shaped by the limits of access. It does not establish that only one outcome exists. This reverses the usual burden of explanation. Multiplicity does not need to be justified as an extension of the theory. It is the restriction to a single outcome that requires justification, especially when no such restriction appears in the formal structure. This does not settle the interpretation of quantum mechanics. Alternative accounts remain possible, but it does clarify the position of many worlds. It aligns with the structure of the theory without introducing additional mechanisms. It explains the singularity of experience without reducing the underlying system. Its significance extends beyond physics. It challenges the assumption that reality must conform to the limits of experience. It suggests that what is encountered may be only a part of what exists. Seen in this light, many worlds is not an extravagant multiplication of realities. It is a refusal to impose limits that the theory itself does not require. The question then is not why there would be many worlds. It is why we have assumed that there must only be one. Section 16. What multiplicity looks like. If the structure of reality does not eliminate possibilities, then it is natural to ask what that actually means, not as an abstract claim, but in terms that can be pictured. What would such a structure look like? From within any given path, it would look exactly as it does now. There would be no visible branching, no overlap, no sense of multiple realities competing for attention. The world would appear stable, continuous, and complete. The difference would not be in what is seen. It would be in what cannot be seen. At every moment where events could unfold in more than one way, different continuations would follow. These do not collapse back into one another. They do not signal their presence. They continue independently, each carrying forward its own sequence of events. Some of these points are subtle, others are fundamental. There are paths in which you were never born. Paths in which different conditions led to a different life entirely. Paths in which your identity formed differently from the very beginning. There are paths in which you exist, but not as you are now. Different biology, different development, a different way of becoming. There may be paths in which you were born the other sex, where your body, your social experience, and your sense of self formed along a different line from the very beginning. From within that path, that life would not feel altered or unusual. It would feel as continuous, as complete, and as real as this one. At this very moment, there could be a version of you standing in front of a mirror, seeing a different face, perhaps even a different sex, living a different life, with no awareness of this one. Not because anything has changed for you, but because you are not on that path. From within experience, only one of these is ever encountered. You experience one life, one history, one continuous thread that feels complete. But if the structure preserves possibilities, then the alternatives do not vanish, they continue. To approach what this means, it helps to move beyond individual examples and think in terms of structure. Imagine something like a tree, but not one that grows from a single moment in time. Imagine a structure that has no beginning and no end, extending in all directions. At every point along it, it divides continuously. Each division gives rise to further divisions, and those in turn continue outward without limit. The branches do not stop. They do not return, they extend, separating further as they go. From within one branch, it feels as though there is only one path. The rest are not visible. There is no sense of standing inside a vast structure. There is only the line you follow. But beyond that line, the structure continues. The scale of this is difficult to hold in mind. It is not a tree in any ordinary sense. Its branches are not finite. Its growth is not something that happens over time from a single origin. It is a structure in which every possible divergence continues outward, without collapse, without convergence. Its canopy is not a surface, but an expanse, an ocean of branches extending beyond any boundary that can be drawn. Not chaotic, but ordered. Not random, but shaped by the same underlying rules at every level. Each branch carries a development, a life, a sequence of events that is internally coherent and complete. From within each, the world feels singular, but the structure as a whole is not. This does not mean that anything imaginable exists. It means that developments consistent with the structure of the world can unfold in different ways, each continuing from the same underlying conditions. The vastness lies not in fantasy, but in continuation. There are more lives that can be experienced from within a single path, more histories than can be known, more developments than can ever be accessed. From within one branch, this vastness is invisible. The world feels complete because only one line is encountered. There is no indication of the others, no trace of their presence. But this absence may reflect a limitation of access, not a limitation of what exists. If the structure of reality does not remove possibilities, then what is experienced is not the whole. It is one branch within something immeasurably larger. Section 17. The Continuum of Identity. You experience yourself as a single identity, one life moving forward through time. Your memories connect, your decisions follow one another, and your sense of self remains continuous. There is no awareness of alternatives, no sense that other versions of you are unfolding alongside this one. That experience feels complete, but it may be complete because it is limited. If multiple outcomes persist, then at every point where events could unfold differently, different continuations follow from that same prior state. Each begins from the same past. Each carries forward a version of the same identity. Each develops independently as events diverge. From within any one of these paths, only one continuation is accessible. The others are not encountered, not because they have been removed, but because they are out of reach. This suggests a shift in how identity is understood. The self, as it is experienced, is not the full extent of identity. It is a single, accessible trajectory within it. Beyond that trajectory, the structure continues. To describe identity as a continuum is to recognize that what appears as a single life may be part of a wider extension, not a shared awareness and not a unified experience, but a set of continuations that all begin from the same origin and then separate. What is shared is not experience, it is the starting point. From within one path, identity feels singular because only one path can be followed. The sense of being one person arises from continuity within that path, not from the absence of others. You do not experience yourself branching, you experience yourself continuing. This is why multiplicity does not feel like fragmentation. There is no sense of division from within experience because no connection is maintained between the different continuations. Each remains internally coherent, carrying forward its own sequence of memory and identity. A continuation along one line does not imply exclusivity. It does not show that no other lines exist. It shows only that they cannot be accessed from where you are. In this sense, identity mirrors the structure of reality itself. What is encountered is local, what may exist extends beyond it. The self, as it is known, is one trajectory that can be followed from within. The continuum of identity is a wider structure that cannot. Conclusion. What has been considered throughout this essay is not simply an interpretation of a theory, but a shift in how the relationship between experience and reality is understood. The expectation that reality must resolve into a single outcome does not arise from the structure of quantum mechanics itself, but from the way in which that structure is encountered. What appears as one world may not be one in itself, but one from within. This distinction is easily overlooked because experience presents itself as complete. There is no indication from within it that anything lies beyond. The world appears singular not because its singularity has been established, but because only one path is ever accessible. The absence of alternatives is taken as evidence that they do not exist, rather than as a feature of the conditions under which they cannot be reached. If the formal structure of quantum mechanics is taken seriously, this assumption becomes difficult to sustain. The theory does not eliminate possibilities. It does not require that one outcome be selected over others. It describes a continuous development in which multiple outcomes can persist, even if they are not accessible from within the same context. What appears as resolution may therefore reflect a limitation of access, rather than a process within reality itself. From this perspective, the many worlds interpretation does not introduce a new kind of reality. It reveals the possible extent of one that may already be present. The idea that there is only one world is not established by the theory, but inferred from the structure of experience. Once that inference is set aside, the possibility emerges that what is encountered is not the whole, but a single trajectory within a larger system. This does not change the world as it is lived. Events still unfold. Identity remains continuous. A life is still experienced as one path. What changes is the context in which that path is understood. It may not be the only continuation. It may be one of many that proceed beyond what can be accessed. The implications are not visible within experience itself. They lie in what is no longer assumed. The question is no longer how reality selects one outcome, but whether it selects at all. The world as it encounters may be complete as a path, but it may not be complete as a whole. Seen in this light, the argument does not establish that the many worlds interpretation must be correct, nor does it rule out alternative accounts of quantum mechanics. Other interpretations remain possible, and each attempts, in its own way, to reconcile the structure of the theory with the character of experience. What distinguishes many worlds is not that it proves multiplicity beyond doubt, but that it follows the mathematical structure of the theory without introducing additional mechanisms. In this sense, it can be understood as a more direct or minimal reading of what the formalism already describes. The question it raises is not whether other interpretations are impossible, but whether they require assumptions that go beyond what the theory itself demands. Author's note: this essay was written out of a need to understand something that feels both simple and unsettling. The idea that reality might not be singular is often treated as extreme, but when the structure of the theory is followed carefully, it begins to feel less like an addition and more like a possibility that was always there. I have tried to approach the subject without forcing it into a familiar shape. Much of what feels intuitive about reality comes from how it is experienced, not necessarily from how it is structured. The aim here has been to separate those two where possible, and to see what remains if the theory is taken seriously on its own terms. This is not an attempt to prove that reality is multiple. It is an attempt to question whether its apparent singularity is as certain as it seems. The argument rests less on claiming something new and more on removing assumptions that may not be required. If there is anything worth taking from this, it is not a conclusion, but a shift in perspective. The possibility that what is encountered is not the whole may be uncomfortable, but it is also difficult to ignore once considered. Ccidfuentes, 2026.